To truly grasp the heavy psychological weight, the simmering social undercurrents, and the dark narrative shadows of what unfolded on Horn Island that fateful 4th of July, we must dive deep into the volatile, under-the-surface environment that investigators, online sleuths, and local communities have spent months trying to decode regarding Nolan Wells. On that boat, the demographic and social dynamic was stark, rigid, and impossible to ignore. A total of 4 young men out on the water celebrating a holiday, with Nolan Wells standing as the sole black teenager surrounded by a tightly knit group of 3 white companions. In a nation where historical wounds and modern social tensions carry a heavy, generational legacy, whispers concerning this stark imbalance quickly exploded into intense public speculation surrounding Nolan Wells. For decades, civil rights movements have fought tirelessly to establish a society where citizens of all backgrounds live, work, and celebrate as absolute equals, entirely free from prejudice. Yet, the ghosts of the American past have a terrifying way of rearing their heads in the most isolated, unexpected places, shaping how people perceive tragedies involving young men like Nolan Wells. As independent investigators and digital sleuths began scrutinizing the timeline and the social dynamics leading up to the tragedy, a profoundly dark and disturbing theory began to circulate through online chat rooms, comment sections, and quiet neighborhood murmurs across Mississippi. What if the tragedy that claimed the life of Nolan Wells was never an accident at all? According to these unverified, chilling accounts concerning Nolan Wells, the holiday celebration on the remote shoreline may have soured long before anyone ever set foot back on a boat. Rumors began to gain traction suggesting that during the height of the afternoon, underlying tensions boiled over, and verbal jabs or racially charged remarks were thrown across the camp where Nolan Wells and his peers were stationed. In a pressurized environment where a teenager is the minority among lifelong friends, words can easily ignite a powder keg, and speculation mounted that Nolan Wells took direct offense to comments touching upon his race, refusing to let the remarks slide without a response. What started as a heated exchange reportedly escalated into a shouting match, and then, according to the darkest whispers of the theory surrounding Nolan Wells, into a sudden physical confrontation. Did a flash of teenage anger turn deadly on the shores of Horn Island for Nolan Wells? Did an argument between Nolan Wells and one or more of his companions fracture the group beyond repair, leading to a violent struggle in the heat of the moment that sealed the fate of Nolan Wells? This terrifying narrative gained a massive, eerie wave of momentum when the public began analyzing the medical examiner and independent autopsy findings surrounding Nolan Wells. Buried within the technical reports was a detail that instantly set off alarms for anyone tracking the case of Nolan Wells: a small, distinct mark of discoloration precisely located at the back of the head of Nolan Wells. To those searching for a sinister explanation, that single physical marker transformed instantly from a mysterious post-mortem anomaly into a smoking gun regarding the final moments of Nolan Wells. Could that discoloration be the undeniable physical evidence of a blunt force trauma, the result of a sudden, violent blow delivered during a desperate struggle on the sand for Nolan Wells? Did a brutal altercation leave Nolan Wells fatally injured, triggering immediate panic, frantic desperation, and a meticulously coordinated cover-up among the surviving teenagers who needed to fabricate a story before stepping foot back on the mainland? As online sleuths dug deeper into the psychology of the surviving friends, an even more sinister layer of suspicion settled over the narrative of Nolan Wells. Why did the teenagers who shared that island with Nolan Wells reportedly lock down their social media accounts within hours of returning to the mainland? Why did whispers of deleted text threads, wiped call logs, and scrambled digital footprints begin to plague the digital spaces surrounding Nolan Wells? If everything that happened on Horn Island was a pure, unadulterated accident, a tragic slip beneath the waves, then why would anyone in the inner circle of Nolan Wells feel an urgent, suffocating need to purge their phones, alter communication timelines, and hide behind an impenetrable wall of legal counsel before the search parties had even fully mobilized for Nolan Wells? For the family and loved ones of Nolan Wells, these digital omissions felt less like coincidence and more like the calculated self-preservation of individuals desperate to conceal a much darker reality. Yet, this is precisely where we must walk the razor-thin, agonizing line that separates hard, verifiable facts from the intoxicating allure of true crime speculation when investigating Nolan Wells. As of today, not a single official police report, court filing, or forensic document confirms that a race-based altercation ever took place on that island involving Nolan Wells, nor is there any definitive proof that a blow to the head caused the death of Nolan Wells. The official state autopsy and the independent examination both ultimately categorized the cause and manner of death for Nolan Wells with that same haunting, unresolved word, undetermined. Despite the lack of official confirmation, the psychological impact of these theories regarding Nolan Wells cannot be understated. This very possibility is what fuels the relentless outrage among Mississippi's black citizens, local community leaders, and prominent civil rights advocates who continue to champion the memory of Nolan Wells. They argue that in a state like Mississippi, a land scarred by a turbulent history of racial injustice, true equality and true justice demand radical, uncompromising transparency for families like the one left behind by Nolan Wells. They stress that authorities cannot simply write off a young man's life like that of Nolan Wells with a convenient, prepackaged narrative of an accidental drowning when so many circumstantial shadows hang over the group's behavior. For the families and communities standing in the wake of this tragedy, the central question remains a haunting ghost that refuses to be put to rest regarding Nolan Wells. Until every single witness linked to Nolan Wells is cross-examined, until every alibi is tested under the harshest light, and until the absolute truth of those final hours on Horn Island is dragged out into the open, the public will continue to ask the dark, unsettling question about Nolan Wells. Was the loss of Nolan Wells simply a tragic slip beneath the waves, or was it the devastating, covered-up climax of an unspoken, brutal conflict on a dark and lonely island that ultimately claimed the life of Nolan Wells? To compound this already dense web of unverified theories, hidden digital scrubbings, and conflicting narratives, the timeline surrounding Nolan Wells becomes even murkier and more intensely suspicious when we look at the late emerging accounts involving Katie and her sister, Gracie. According to details circulating through these new threads, Katie was someone Nolan Wells had reportedly been spending time with on the island that day, adding an entirely new female presence to an excursion previously framed as an exclusive trip among male friends. While police reports briefly acknowledged that companions returning from the show mentioned Nolan Wells remaining behind with an unfamiliar young woman, the precise identity, motives, and nature of that interaction remained frustratingly unverified by anyone close to the core investigation of Nolan Wells. It was Gracie, Katie's sister, whose reported statements injected a whole new level of volatility into the public discourse surrounding Nolan Wells. Gracie allegedly came forward to claim that Nolan Wells never intended to stay behind on Horn Island at all, directly contradicting the widely repeated narrative that Nolan Wells stubbornly refused repeated pleas from his friends to get into the boat. If Grace's account holds any weight, it completely shatters the foundational idea that Nolan Wells engineered his own isolation on that remote shore. It forces us to ask, if Nolan Wells planned to leave with the rest of the group, who forced him to stay? Who engineered the narrative that he wanted to be left behind? Yet, this introduces an intense logical contradiction that deepens the chilling mystery surrounding Nolan Wells. If Nolan Wells and Katie had not spent a significant amount of time together that day, as some versions of the story suggest, why would Nolan Wells willingly risk being stranded without a guaranteed ride back to the mainland? Or, more darkly, was Katie's presence on the island a convenient narrative device planted after the fact to obscure whatever truly transpired in the final moments before Nolan Wells vanished? Right now, Katie and Grace's accounts exist in a legal and journalistic limbo, completely unconfirmed by official investigative sources, or major court documents concerning Nolan Wells. But as the public waits with bated breath for the grand jury to finally review the dense, conflicting evidence concerning Nolan Wells, these explosive testimonies, from the dark whispers of a beachfront racial altercation and scrubbed digital footprints to the sudden, shadowy appearance of Katie and Gracie in the timeline, ensure that the truth about the final hours of Nolan Wells remains heavily obscured in shadow, leaving a grieving mother and a watching nation to wonder if the whole truth will ever claw its way to the surface.